hybrid event. And of course, thank you to the editorial staff and associates for the continued hard work of moving our publication forward. The New England Law Review is a team effort, and each of you have done your part splendidly. The New England Law Review has been an entirely student-run publication since 1965. Each year, we publish thought-provoking legal scholarship written by both professional and student authors. As part of that mission, we are pleased to introduce today's conversation, which will explore the intersection of misinformation, technology, and international politics through discussion of Professor David L. Sloss's recent book, Tyrants on Twitter: Protecting Democracies from Information Warfare. Bringing this conversation to New England Law Boston is something that we are incredibly proud of and excited to be a part of today. We cannot thank Professor Sloss enough for sharing his time and expertise with us. We are truly grateful to get to learn with you and from you today. We would also like to thank our respondents and everyone present today for contributing to this important discussion. Lastly, I would like to thank Professor Lawrence Friedman for his guidance and all that he has done to help make this discussion possible, and Professor Ryan Groff for graciously agreeing to moderate today. Before I hand over the Zoom to Professor Sloss to begin his presentation, I would like to quickly explain the mechanics of our hybrid event, as well as introduce our esteemed guests today. Since COVID, we have hosted our symposia on Zoom. Over those years, we have grown to value the flexibility it offers us and those who would like to participate but are not local to the Boston area. Today, we strive to enjoy the best of both in-person and virtual symposia by having a space designated on campus to participate. If you are currently viewing from the Cherry Room, thank you. As you may notice, there are several Law Review staff members ready to collect your questions on note cards throughout the presentation by Professor Sloss and our discussion contributors. They will bring your questions to Kiera, who will input them into the Zoom for our moderator to ask during the discussion portion of the event. If you are attending through Zoom, you get to save a step and write your questions directly into the Zoom chat function to Kiera Martin. Depending on the number of questions, we may not be able to ask every single one, but we hope to ask as many as we can. Without further ado, it is a pleasure to introduce our esteemed guests. In addition to being our moderator today, Professor Ryan Groff is a member of the Massachusetts Bar and a lecturer in law at New England Law Boston, where he teaches multiple courses, including a new course he developed called Law, Innovation, and Technology. He has worked in product and marketing roles at legal technology companies around the world and is currently at Casetext. Ryan is a board member at the Healthmere Center for Cultural Engagement and a proud graduate of the evening program at New England Law Boston. He lives north of Boston with his wife and 4 children. Professor Lawrence Friedman also joins us today as a discussion contributor. Professor Friedman teaches constitutional law, privacy law, and national security law. He has written widely on these subjects and in the area of the state constitutional law. His book on state constitutional law, The Law of American State Constitutions, co-written with Robert Williams, is forthcoming this year with the Oxford University Press. While he unfortunately cannot join us today, Professor Ido Kilavati is the Frederick Dowart and Zadalis Family Fund Associate Professor of Law. He comes to the College of Law after 2 years as a research scholar in law at Yale Law School. At Yale, he was a cyber fellow at the Center for Global Legal Challenges and a resident fellow at the Information Society Project, where he remains an associated fellow. He specializes in the intersection of technology, law, and society with a focus in cybersecurity, both domestic and international. His specific areas of research include cybersecurity law, computer crime law, and domestic and global technology regulation. His research appeared in the UC Irvine Law Review, Ohio State Law Journal, Tennessee Law Review, Harvard National Security Journal, Berkeley Law and Technology Journal, and more, including an upcoming piece in our own New England Law Review, which I have the privilege to discuss later today in his stead. Professor Kilavati's op-eds and essays appeared in the Harvard Law Review blog, Lawfare, Just Security, Wired, and TechCrunch. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor David L. Sloss. Professor Sloss is a John A. and Elizabeth L. Sutro Professor of Law at Santa Clara University. He is the author of The Death of Treaty Supremacy, An Invisible Constitutional Change by Oxford University Press, and Tyrants on Twitter, Protecting Democracies from Information Warfare. He is the co-editor of International Law in the U.S. Supreme Court, Continuity and Change, from the Cambridge University Press, and sole editor of The Role of Domestic Courts in Treaty Enforcement, a comparative study by Cambridge University Press. He also published several dozen book chapters and law review articles. His book on the death of treaty supremacy and his edited volume on the international law in the U.S. Supreme Court both won prestigious book awards from the American Society of International Law. Professor Sloss is a member of the American Law Institute and counselor to the American Society of International Law. His scholarship is informed by extensive government experience. Before entering academia, he spent 9 years in the federal government, where he worked on US-Soviet arms control negotiations and nuclear proliferation issues. And without further ado, I will now turn our presentation over to Professor Sloss. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you for having me here today for this great event. Thanks also to all of the law review editors who I know put a lot of time and effort into preparing this. And finally, thanks to the other participants in today's symposium. So I am going to talk to you today about my book, Tyrants on Twitter. Here's a picture of the book cover. I will say this is the first, I've done several books, but this is the first one I've ever done that is also out in audiobook format. For those of you who like to listen to your books rather than read your books, you can get it from Audible, the audiobook. Okay, so the central argument that I present in the book really starts with the premise that we are in a new Cold War with China. And I need to say a little bit about what I mean by that. A lot of people find the phrase Cold War sort of scary and off-putting. I don't think it means that we're in a sort of a struggle to the death where one side will be, utterly defeated and the other one will declare victory. I actually don't see that happening anytime soon. I think we're in a long-term geopolitical struggle where the US and China are going to be the dominant players in the international arena, and we're competing with each other to sort of influence the future direction of the international system. And we really compete in three areas. Military competition is one, but like the old Cold War with the Soviet Union, both the United States and China have a strong incentive to avoid direct military competition, because if we get into a hot war, a real military conflict, we both end up losing. So hopefully we avoid that. Economic competition, second area of competition. Here there's a big difference between the sort of current Cold War and the old Cold War with the Soviet Union. We did actually beat the Soviet Union economically. They basically had a dysfunctional economic system, and that was one of the reasons why we ended up winning the last Cold War, and they ended up losing the last Cold War because of economics. Certainly in the near term, that doesn't seem likely with China. China actually is largely an economic success story. We don't know where it's going to go in the next 10 or 20 years, but I don't expect that we're going to outcompete China economically in the near term. So that really places a premium on information competition as a sort of a third area of competition. And here again, we have real differences from the old Cold War, mostly because of changes in the nature of technology. Information technology has really been transformed since the last Cold War ended in about 1990. So I think this is going to be an important area of competition. And one of my main claims in the book is that the United States is effectively subsidizing Chinese and Russian information warfare by allowing Chinese and Russian state agents unrestricted access to US social media platforms. Those social media platforms are actually incredibly helpful tools in the current information competition. And we're giving them free access to those tools. And I think that's a major strategic mistake. So I will come back and talk about that more in a bit, but that's sort of one of my first big points. Second key point here is that Chinese and Russian information warfare poses a significant threat to Western democracies and contributes to the problem of democratic decay. Now, I'm going to give you a little data in just a minute about democratic decay to say what I mean by that. Certainly, information warfare is not the only factor contributing to democratic decay, but I think it's one of them. And so my sort of main policy takeaway here is that I think we need to regulate social media more than we currently are in order to protect democracies from information warfare. And in particular, we need regulatory harmonization among leading Western democracies. And I will talk more later about my proposal for an alliance for democracy, which would bring together about 35 to 40 liberal democratic states to work together in regulating social media to protect democracy. When we think about this in strategic terms, one of my claims here is that the power to regulate really is a strategic asset, and we need to think about it as a strategic asset in this ongoing geopolitical competition. And so far, by our failure to regulate social media or regulate in any meaningful way, we're really squandering that asset. And that asset, that power to regulate, is something that can really help us in the geopolitical competition with both China and Russia. All right, so let me begin here then by talking a little bit about the problem of democratic decay. This chart shows basically the percentage of states in the world that are classified as either democratic or autocratic. It's based on data from the Varieties of Democracy Institute, or VDEM Institute, which tracks this. And what we can see is that in the sort of early post-Cold War period, that is from 1990 until 2006, democracy was on the rise and autocracy was in decline. The percentage of states in the world that are classified as autocracies dropped from about 50% in 1990 to under 25% in 2006. Meanwhile, the percentage of states that are classified as democracies increased from about 25% in 1990 to about 35% in 2006. And by the way, the reason those numbers don't add up to 100% is there's a middle category of what are often called hybrid states, which I did not include on this graph. So basically from 1990 to 2006, we're seeing really favorable trends here in terms of the rise of democracy and the decline of autocracy. But since then, those trends have reversed. And what we've seen since, depending on sort of which number you want to track, but since about 2009 or 2011, a troubling reversal of these trends. So you can see that the percentage of autocratic states in the world hit bottom in 2011 at about 22% and has been rising since then. The most recent data shown on this graph is from 2019, but if you carry this forward to 2020 or 2021, that percentage of autocratic states is continuing to increase. Okay? Meanwhile, the percentage of democratic states really peaked in 2009 at about 34% and has been going downhill since then, and according to the latest figures here is about 30%. So I think these trends are troubling. This is what I'm referring to when I talk about democratic decay. And as I said, I think information warfare is one factor that is contributing to this process of democratic decay. So let me talk a little bit now about what I mean by information warfare. Information warfare really sits at the intersection between two different phenomena. One is foreign influence operations. Foreign influence operations have been around for decades, if not centuries. This just refers to attempts by one state to influence domestic politics in a different state. So states, and particularly large, powerful states, have been engaging in foreign influence operations for a long, long time. There's nothing particularly new about that. Obviously, organized social media manipulation is much newer because that is a phenomenon that only comes along with the rise of social media in the last 20 years. And what I mean by organized social media manipulation, and this isn't really my term, I'm borrowing this term from other scholars, is the use of social media by governments and or by political parties to shape political events, particularly around elections, but not exclusively around elections. And what's become quite commonplace now, you think about President Obama's run for the presidency in 2008. He was probably the first American president to make extensive use of social media in a political campaign. Donald Trump obviously made extensive use of social media in his campaign for presidency in 2016 and again in 2020. And this has now become common really throughout democracies all over the world, is that candidates hire PR firms to manage their social media presence for them to try and influence voters, right? So that's organized social media manipulation in a democratic context, in a domestic context. But organized social media manipulation is also now used by a number of states to essentially conduct foreign influence operations. And that's what I really mean by information warfare, is the use of social media to conduct foreign influence operations. And there are about half a dozen states in the world, maybe 10 states in the world, depending on who you look at, that are actively doing this these days. But I'm going to focus here primarily on China and Russia, since they are our two major adversaries. Now, when you look at what are the information warfare tactics that China and Russia use, there's a great quote from a guy who used to serve on the National Security Council staff in the White House, who said, "Russia is a hurricane, China is climate change." And I think that quote nicely captures the differences between the two of them, right? Russia's approach to information warfare is primarily negative and destructive. Russia is out to sort of upend and tear down the sort of or particular aspects of the current international system. China's approach is much more gradualist and more positive. China does have a positive vision of a different kind of international order that it would like to create. And they're willing to be patient, although maybe a little less patient now than they were a few years ago, but generally taking a slow, gradual approach to reshaping the liberal international order and replacing it with something that is more illiberal. So let me talk about Russian electoral interference in Western democracies. As many of you know, after the revelations about the Russian interference in the 2016 US election, Robert Mueller was appointed as special counsel to investigate. He prepared a very lengthy, detailed report that runs to 400 pages, documenting in great detail Russian interference in the 2016 US election. And he concluded that Russian interference was both sweeping and systematic, very far-reaching, and he personally didn't comment, or his report didn't comment on the influence of Russian interference. But a scholar named Kathleen Hall Jamieson, who's a professor in communication studies at University of Pennsylvania, wrote a book called Cyber War, in which she goes in great detail. And her main conclusion is that there is ample evidence out there to suggest that Russia may have actually swung the outcome in the three key swing states in that election, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And that we can't prove this, we don't know this for a fact, but just the fact that it seems at least plausible to suggest that Russia actually swung the election in favor of Donald Trump is a pretty scary thing to contemplate, in my view. Regardless of whether you like Donald Trump or not, I would hope that everybody would agree that that having Russian agents basically dictating the outcome in a U.S. election is not something we want. Now, in addition to interference in the United States, there's evidence showing that Russia has interfered in elections in at least 20 other countries that are members of either the European Union or NATO or both since 2014. And Russia's goal clearly has been to weaken both NATO and the European Union. I have on the slide here that it's been a partial success. I think the best evidence of that success is the rise of right-wing parties in Europe over the last decade or so. Russia has been generally aligned with these extreme right-wing parties in Europe, and we see them gaining an increasing share of the vote in a number of different Western European countries. Most recently in Italy, we've now got a government in Italy as of a few days ago that's led by someone who's, led by a political party that traces its roots to Mussolini and the Nazis. So this rise of the far right in Europe, I think, is troubling, and Russia has contributed to that in a variety of ways. Now, I will say the Russian invasion of Ukraine really backfired in this respect. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has generally sort of strengthened and reinvigorated NATO. So that was arguably a serious strategic mistake on Putin's part. But I will leave that comment there, and I want to now go on and talk about China. So this slide compares likes on Facebook between major Chinese media companies and major US media companies. And you'll see there that if we try and use likes on Facebook as a metric to measure the reach of different media companies, you've got 5 Chinese state media companies, and these are all basically state-controlled or party-controlled media companies out of China. Party-controlled meaning controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. 5 different Chinese state media companies that actually have bigger followings on Facebook than any of the major US media companies. And it's important to note that Facebook is essentially banned in China. So all of these likes on Facebook for these Chinese state media companies, they're not coming from people in China, they're coming from people scattered all over the world. And this is at least one useful bit of evidence to show the influence of Chinese state media around the world. Starting in about 2009, China made a major commitment to invest in the growth of its state media companies and to use those state media companies to influence political developments all over the world. And I'd say China has been quite successful in carrying out that strategy, at least in terms of reaching a large audience. Now, how much influence they have over that audience is harder to measure, but there are a variety of metrics out there that show that these Chinese state media companies are reaching a very large global audience. One other sort of point to raise here with respect to China, some of you may know that WeChat is a big Chinese social media platform. People refer to it as the sort of Chinese equivalent of Facebook, but in some ways that is a bit misleading. I like to think of it as Facebook and Amazon rolled into one, because WeChat is also a major shopping platform as well as a social media platform. So it's been known for quite a while that China sort of monitors WeChat to conduct surveillance on its own citizens and to censor its own citizens. But one very troubling development here is that WeChat has something like 120 million users outside of China. Most of those WeChat users outside of China are ethnic Chinese who have left China and relocated to places like the United States, Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom. Generally, a lot of ethnic Chinese living in Western democracies are on WeChat fairly regularly to communicate with family back in China or for other kinds of reasons. So as a result of that, Western politicians who have large numbers of ethnic Chinese constituents have started to use WeChat as a tool to communicate with their constituents. But research out of the University of Toronto shows that China exercises tremendous control over this platform. And because of its control over the platform, they are now actually able to conduct censorship and surveillance in terms of monitoring communications between politicians in Western democracies and their constituents, and censoring some of those communications. When things come up that the Chinese don't like, they actually engage in active censorship to essentially control what it is that Western politicians can say to their constituents, at least on this platform, and vice versa. So that's a pretty troubling sign of sort of Chinese meddling in Western politics. So stepping back from the details and taking a somewhat bigger picture here, I want to suggest that information warfare is fundamentally asymmetric in important ways. That is, Russia and China are able to exploit information warfare to both undermine democracy in current democracies and also to some extent to promote autocracy in other states. But we really cannot do to them what they do to us. And there are two basic reasons for that. One is that Russia and China specifically, and autocratic states more generally, tend to maintain fairly closed information environments. In contrast, democratic states tend to maintain fairly open information environments. So that asymmetry between open and closed information environments means it's much easier for them to interfere in our information ecosystem than it is the other way around. And the other feature of this is that they don't conduct free and fair elections. So even if we could meddle in their information ecosystem, we have no ability to control electoral processes in Russia and China, or to even influence electoral processes in Russia and China in any significant way. They do actually have a substantial ability to influence electoral processes in Western democracies, and they've used that ability to significant effect. So my conclusion from this is that we really need better defenses. We're not going to be able to sort of reciprocate in kind by sort of, using information warfare to go after them. So we need to do a better job defending ourselves against Chinese and Russian information warfare. And I'm going to shift gears now to talk about my sort of policy proposal, which is really the second half of the book. The first half of the book examines the problem. The second half of the book lays out a proposed solution. And one of the key ideas in my proposed solution is, and I'm particularly borrowing sort of a military metaphor here, to shift the attack-defense ratio. So what do I mean by talking about shifting the attack-defense ratio? Essentially, under the current system, foreign agents can create 10 new fake accounts in less time and for less cost than it takes for companies to block one fake account. And by fake accounts, I'm referring generally to accounts set up on social media platforms in which someone assumes some kind of fictitious identity, pretends to be somebody other than who they are. And this strategy of using fake accounts was central to Russian interference in the 2016 election in the United States, you had all kinds of Russian agents setting up accounts as people who pretended to be African Americans or pretended to be sort of gun right activists or gun right activists, or pretended to be sort of anti-immigration people or whatever. There were hundreds of these fake accounts, and some of them attracted like tens of thousands of followers. So they were very successful in using these fake identities to sort of intervene in the US political system. And they've done this in other countries too. China has not been as sophisticated in Russia in making use of these fake accounts. So in shifting the attack defense ratio, the idea is to make it much more costly and time consuming for these foreign agents to create new fake accounts and make it much cheaper and easier to detect and block those fake accounts. Now, I should say nothing we do here is going to eliminate this problem entirely. No matter what we do, Russia and China will still be able to create some of these fake accounts and to maintain them for some period of time until they're discovered. But by making it much more costly and time consuming for them to do this, this evens out the asymmetry between autocratic states and democratic states in the use of social media to conduct information warfare. So how do we shift the attack defense ratio? Well, my regulatory proposal consists of these 6 elements that I lay out here in this slide. First, as I mentioned before, create an alliance for democracy consisting of about 35 or 40 states that all have solid credentials as liberal democracies. This would be a new international organization, but it wouldn't require a big bureaucratic staff to staff the organization. I envision a fairly small staff. It's mostly means to allow all of these states to cooperate in defense of democracy. The rules would allow unrestricted free speech on social media for citizens and nationals of alliance member states. So no at least direct impact in restricting free speech for US citizens, Canadian citizens, French citizens, etc. And by the way, foreigners who are in the United States as legal permanent residents would have the option as sort of registering as US, basically giving their nationality of US for these purposes, so that free speech applies to them as well. The flip side is that my proposal involves banning Chinese and Russian state agents from major social media platforms. So this doesn't mean that ordinary Chinese and Russian citizens are banned. They have access to these platforms, but anybody who's acting as an agent of the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party or the Russian government would be banned. I do include an exemption for benign state agents. So somebody like, say, one of those Chinese state media companies could apply for an exemption, and those would have to be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Then for basically everybody else in the world, that is citizens and nationals of countries that are not alliance member states and that are not Russia or China, they have largely unrestricted free speech on social media, but there are disclaimer rules for election-related speech. So let me say a little bit more about how that would work. Let's assume that Venezuela is not a member of the alliance, and somebody in Venezuela is interested in following elections in Canada, and they want to comment on some upcoming election in Canada. Well, they're allowed to do that, but the social media companies would be required to attach a disclaimer, that is a kind of a warning label, whenever somebody from Venezuela is commenting on elections in Canada, or more broadly, when somebody from a state that is not a member of the alliance is commenting on an election in a state that is a member of the alliance. And so if you think about the Venezuelan commenting on a Canadian election, the Canadian citizens would essentially be informed that, hey, this is coming from somebody outside Canada, from somebody outside the alliance, from somebody who's a citizen or national of a state that is not a democracy. So that Venezuelan gets to say whatever they want to say, but the recipients of that message get this warning to alert them, tell them something about where it's coming from. All right. There would be a social media registration system, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. I'll give you some details on the next slide. But there would be detailed safeguards in the system to guarantee, or you can't really guarantee, but to protect user privacy and data security. And I think that's really important, because as soon as I use the word social media registration system, people get all worried about user privacy and data security. So there's a bunch of safeguards built into the system to address that issue. All right, so what does the registration system look like? Essentially, everybody who is on a social media platform has to make a decision up front. Do I want a public account or a private account? If I'm worried about registering, I can opt for a private account. With a private account, I'm limited in the size of the audience that I can reach, but I don't have to go through the registration requirement. If I want to be able to reach a larger audience, then I'm required to register as a public account. And in that registration, I would declare my nationality and I would provide certain identifying information. Now, the reality is that most of the countries that would be members of this alliance have a national ID system in which everybody has a unique identifying number under that national ID system. So in those countries, registration is pretty simple. I say, I'm a French national, here's my national ID number. That I give that information to Facebook. Facebook conveys that information to the French government. The French government says, yes, indeed, there is a French citizen with this name and this ID number. We can confirm that this is a real person, right? Or there's a real person who matches this identifying information. In the United States, it's a little more complicated because we don't have a national ID number. There's always been resistance to creating national ID numbers, but we have social security numbers, we have passport numbers. For legal permanent residents, they have numbers assigned by the Department of Homeland Security. So there are different options in the US about how this would be carried out, but basically the idea is that people are setting up public accounts, give their name and nationality and identifying information to the social media company. The social media company checks with the government. If I claim to be Canadian, they check with the Canadian government. If I claim to be French, they check with the French government to confirm that this is not a fake person, right? There is actually a real person who matches this name and identifying information. And if so, then they're allowed to go ahead and set up an account. Okay. So what are the basic costs and benefits of this proposal? As I said earlier, one of the main sort of tactical benefits is that it would make it much more costly and time consuming for foreign agents to create fake accounts on social media. That's a huge benefit. That matters a lot in terms of, as I said, leveling the playing field between democracies and autocracies. It also has an important tactical benefit, and it would limit the spread of propaganda and disinformation. Now, how much would it limit it? It's hard to measure that, but it would have some effect in limiting the spread of propaganda and disinformation, at least insofar as you think that foreign agents are responsible for spreading that. Now, obviously, there's a lot of domestic sources of propaganda and disinformation, and the proposal is not going to address those domestic sources, but it will address foreign sources. And, the main strategic goal here is to sort of halt or reverse the process of democratic decay by limiting the ability of Chinese and Russian agents to intervene in Western democracies or interfere in Western democracies in ways that contribute to that problem of democratic decay. What are the costs on the other side? Well, there's certainly some administrative costs and burdens, both for governments and for social media companies. Although I think those administrative costs are not great. There's certainly, when we're talking about very large companies, they have plenty of assets to be able to implement this kind of system. I do include a proposal, in the proposal, a sort of a threshold cutoff where smaller companies would not be subject to the system. I think it's important to leave space there for smaller companies who want to sort of break into this space to grow and develop. And I think until they reach a certain threshold, it makes sense to exclude them from this regulatory system. But as long as they're small, the ability of China or Chinese and Russian agents to use those smaller companies to reach large audiences is limited because there's not a large audience on those platforms. One big concern that people raise is about privacy and anonymity with the registration system. And let me actually address specifically that anonymity point, because I haven't talked about that. So right now, if I want to set up an account on Facebook, I actually don't have an account on Facebook. I have an account on Twitter, but not Facebook. I have to give Facebook. Well, I have to give Facebook my real name. Actually, Facebook's not a good example because they require me to appear under my real name. Twitter allows me to sort of give them my real name, but appear under a pseudonym. When I was a kid, one of the greatest basketball players around was a guy went by the name Dr. J. So I use the Dr. J example. Let's say I set up an account on Twitter and I tell them I want to appear publicly as Dr. J. That's perfectly fine under my proposal. I can do that. And the information linking Dr. J to David Sloss would be closely held and would be known only to a small number of people within Twitter. Specifically, that information would not be shared with any government. So the government, when they see stuff posted by Dr. J, has no way of knowing that actually Dr. J is David Sloss because that information is never shared with them. So the system basically preserves my ability to speak under a pseudonym so that if I'm worried about the government, monitoring my speech on social media, they can't do that. If I'm worried about the companies monitoring my speech on social media, well, they can do that, but they can do that now, right? So my proposal doesn't change that in any way. It essentially leaves it where it is. As I said, there's a variety of other measures I've built into this, and I'm not going to go into detail. Maybe we can talk about some of that in the Q&A that protect user privacy and data security. Now, the other big effect or the other big objection has to do with that this will have a chilling effect on free speech. And here I just want to talk a little bit about the First Amendment. The final chapter in the book deals with the First Amendment based on the assumption that we get this sort of international agreement for this regulatory system. We need to apply that domestically, and to apply that domestically, Congress enacts legislation to implement this transnational system. And so how do we evaluate that legislation under the First Amendment? Well, I begin by pointing out that there's a real split in First Amendment jurisprudence between two different views of the First Amendment. And I refer to these as the Madisonian view and the libertarian view. The Madisonian view is, associated with James Madison. Libertarian view is really the trend on the Supreme Court these days. So particularly the conservatives on the court today take a fairly libertarian view of the First Amendment. And I would say that in general, my proposal is not particularly problematic from a Madisonian perspective. It is somewhat problematic from a libertarian perspective, although I present an argument why I can't say that the court would necessarily uphold the constitutionality of this proposal, but I think there are reasonable arguments that could be made to persuade even the libertarians on the court that the proposal is constitutionally sound and consistent with the First Amendment. Now, in walking through that argument, we got to start with whose rights are at stake. So the Supreme Court has made clear that foreigners outside the United States do not enjoy protection under the First Amendment. So insofar as the ban on Chinese and Russian agents, I assume that most of these Chinese and Russian agents who are using social media to conduct information warfare are based in either China or Russia. They don't have any First Amendment rights, so there's no problem there. However, we as American citizens, I'm not sure if everybody on this call or this meeting is an American citizen, but I'll assume most of the people here are American citizens. We do have a First Amendment right to hear what those foreigners are saying, right? So that's whose rights are at stake. To some extent, the system also implicates the First Amendment rights of the social media companies like Facebook and Twitter, right? So I want to talk about three different aspects of the proposal. One is the requirement for the companies to apply these disclaimers, warnings, right, to speech, electoral related speech by certain foreigners. That's almost certainly constitutional. We have a long history of Supreme Court opinions of approving disclaimer requirements for certain kinds of electoral speech. This has become a part of election law in this country. So I think the requirement to apply disclaimers is not terribly controversial and would almost certainly be upheld as a valid provision under the First Amendment. The registration requirement raises issues about what under First Amendment doctrine is often referred to as compelled disclosure. There are cases in which the Supreme Court has invalidated compelled disclosure requirements under the First Amendment, but there are other cases where the court has upheld compelled disclosure requirements under the First Amendment. And in particular, where those compelled disclosure requirements are linked to disclaimer requirements and are necessary in order to carry out a disclaimer regime, the court has generally said that's okay. So here, right, what is the purpose of compelled disclosure? Well, one of the purposes of compelled disclosure is so that the companies know which statements are subject to the disclaimer requirement and which statements are not subject to the disclaimer requirement. So you can't really have a disclaimer regime here without the compelled disclosure, meaning without the requirement that people declare their nationality when they set up an account. Right. So I think the court would probably uphold the compelled disclosure requirement, although there's certainly some plausible arguments on the other side, and I'm less confident in saying they would uphold that than I am in saying they would uphold the disclaimer requirement. Probably the most controversial provision here is the ban on foreign agents. One question that arises is electoral speech by foreign state agents, is that unprotected speech under the First Amendment? Is it subject to intermediate scrutiny? Is it subject to strict scrutiny? It's hard to say. Though I think there's a good argument to be made that it should be treated as unprotected speech under the First Amendment, but I don't think the court would go for that. I think the court would say this is protected speech, therefore it gets either intermediate scrutiny or strict scrutiny. I think the argument could go either way on that, whether they say it's intermediate scrutiny or strict scrutiny. But I make the argument in the book that even under strict scrutiny, there's some precedents here for upholding this requirement even under, even if the court decides that it really is subject to strict scrutiny. Again, I can't say here that the proposal would definitely survive First Amendment attack. I can say it would almost certainly be subject to a First Amendment challenge. And we can't predict the outcome of that kind of First Amendment litigation with confidence, but I think there are good arguments to be made in support of the proposal. All right, so in conclusion, let me just say that I think people who don't like my proposal accuse me of adopting or promoting illiberal policies in order to defend liberal values. I don't actually think that the ban and the registration requirement are illiberal. I think that this goes into some debates about, well, what are really the core values of liberalism? What is liberalism about? But I think a liberal view of the First Amendment or a liberal view of freedom of speech would say that two of the core goals that we're really trying to accomplish by protecting freedom of speech is we want to make sure that truth wins out over falsehood in the marketplace of ideas. And we want to make sure that free speech is a tool that serves the goal of promoting a healthy democracy. And I think that my proposal is consistent with both of these goals, right? It helps ensure that truth will prevail over lies in the marketplace of ideas, and it helps ensure that our information environment is such that it supports and promotes a healthy democracy. So I think, at least in my view, this proposal is consistent with liberal values, although my critics say otherwise. So let me stop there, and I look forward to hearing the comments from others, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Slass. First and foremost, wow, a lot to think about there. Professor Friedman, I believe you are upstairs in the cherry room. Would you like to take this time to offer your comments?
All right. Thank you all who are here and who are watching via Zoom. Thank you, especially Professor Slass, for this very interesting book and this presentation today, and for allowing us to highlight your book and your work in this presentation. You know, I have read the book, and listening to your presentation today can't help thinking that the world is awash in disinformation, and you have really done a tremendous job of isolating this particular sector of disinformation that poses a genuine national security challenge to the United States and to liberal democracies. I'm wondering, though, particularly in respect to the First Amendment, which I know a lot more about than pretty much everything else you talked about, I am, like you, sympathetic to the Madisonian conception of free speech, but I feel, especially after the Supreme Court's most recent term, that the libertarians are going to win the day. And so I suppose I have a two-part question to get us started. The first is, have you thought, since that the most recent term has ended, about what the court has said about how it's going to go about doing constitutional law, particularly in respect to the Second Amendment? And in the Second Amendment case, the Bruin case, it said something, the majority also said something about how it's going to approach the First Amendment. And second, if, like me, you're inclined to think the libertarians might win the day, what other possibilities exist for the implementation of the regulatory scheme that you have in mind?
Do you want me to answer these questions now, or are we going to go on to others first?
If you would like to answer that question now, I think you are more than welcome to, and then we can talk more about Professor Kilavati's article before moving into the more formal discussion portion.
Okay, great. So Professor Friedman, thank you for those questions. You know, you're right that the court is definitely moving in a more libertarian direction. And, you know, at this point, we've got basically a sort of a 6-3 split, although I should say that, you know, this sort of libertarian Madisonian division does not precisely track the sort of liberal conservative split on the court. So we'll see. Now, you mentioned sort of constitutional methodology as laid out in the Broom case. My own view is that the court has been inconsistent on the methodology of constitutional interpretation, and will continue to be inconsistent on the methodology of constitutional interpretation. The methodology changes with the case because I think to at least some extent, the court is results driven, and they're going to adopt a methodology that supports the result that they want. And I will say that at least some of the conservatives on the court are going to be very sympathetic to an argument that, you know, we need to take these measures in the context of, you know, the new Cold War with China, right? So that framing of this in terms of a new Cold War with China may pull some committed First Amendment libertarians to accept limitations they wouldn't accept in other contexts. So, for example, in a case that Justice Kavanaugh wrote an opinion when he was a judge on the DC Circuit before he was elevated to the Supreme Court, there was a case involving campaign contributions by foreign nationals. The Supreme Court in Citizens United had said pretty categorically that you cannot use sort of speaker-based constraints to limit campaign contributions. They said that in the context of looking at distinctions between corporations and natural persons. And they said, once you start discriminating on the basis of who the speaker is, that's highly constitutionally suspect. But Justice Kavanaugh wrote an opinion in a different case on the DC Circuit. Well, but when we're talking about foreign nationals, that's different. And speaker-based constraints for foreign nationals are okay. So, Kavanaugh's opinion in that case suggests that he at least might be sympathetic to the kind of regulation I'm proposing. But again, I don't know. The one other thing I was going to mention is that, one of the few cases, there have been only a couple of cases since Justice Roberts became Chief Justice, in which the court has said, here is a law that is subject to strict scrutiny, but the law still is valid under the First Amendment, even though it's subject to strict scrutiny. One of those is Holder v. Humanitarian Law Project, a case that liberals tended to criticize and conservatives tended to defend. And that was a law that basically, I won't go into the details, but it basically pitted national security against freedom of speech. And a conservative court came out sort of upholding the law as valid because of the national security framing. So they said, look, this gets strict scrutiny, but it survives strict scrutiny. And I think that the strategy that the government took in defending the law in that case would be equally applicable to defending the regulatory system that I am proposing. And so you might be able to get some win over some conservative votes in favor of this because it involves Russia and China and the new Cold War. So let me stop with that, and I'm happy to hear from you.
Wonderful. Thank you for that response. Speaking of responses, I have the pleasure of speaking on behalf of Professor Kilavati today, as he was unable to join us. Top of being an esteemed academic in cybersecurity, Professor Kilavati also wrote a response piece to Professor Slass's book, the major points of which I am pleased to offer today. So professors Kilovati's response primarily focused on the data and security risks associated with the implementation of a verification process, as described in Professor Schloss's book. As nations like Russia, China, and if pursued, those countries in an alliance for democracy exercise more control over how the internet is filtered and used by its citizens and the citizens outside of its virtual borders, Professor Kilovati calls this natural sort of split or separation, the balkanization of social media. And that's sort of the crux of his discussion. So after providing an overview of Professor Schloss's solution and proposals, he shifts the focus of his response piece to really deep dive in the data and security risks associated with the proposed verification system, which Professor Schloss has also discussed some of the struggles and the challenges associated with pursuing that end. He starts with a discussion of cybersecurity and the challenges associated with sufficiently safeguarding sensitive user data in light of social media verification. Many US citizens currently distrust the government to keep data secure due to a significant number of breaches, including the 2015 OPM breach, which compromised millions of social security numbers. However, Professor Kilovati does not consider this to be a significant hurdle to Professor Schloss's verification process, asserting that while no cybersecurity system is perfect, basic protective measures are readily available and can prevent breaches like those seen in 2015. Two-factor authentication and data encryption are two easy ways to help protect sensitive data and prevent breaches. Professor Kilovati also highlights the importance of viewing cybersecurity as a process rather than just a list of checkboxes, meaning that to be effective, an organization cannot implement security measures and then consider the data protected. They must review, evaluate, and improve regularly in order to stay ahead of any hackers' advances. Professor Kilovati also speaks about the risks of data retention, particularly of sensitive information that might be collected during a social media registration. Currently in the United States, there are no mandatory laws on data retention, but Professor Kilovati suggests that destroying records collected for verification purposes is a good way to ensure that it remains protected. Having a massive database of the verification information would be highly appealing to hackers, both foreign and domestic. So only keeping that data for as long as is absolutely necessary helps prevent large-scale breaches, like the one seen by major Indian biometric ID database, Aadhaar, and I apologize if I mispronounce the name of that company. While the data is being held, Professor Kilovati emphasizes the importance of encryption and specifically hashing, which Schloss describes in his book as a special cryptographic function to transform one set of data into another of fixed length by using a mathematical process. Hashing is a particularly useful form of encryption because it prevents anyone who does successfully breach cybersecurity measures from accessing any useful data that would help foreign agents to register imposter accounts. In this context, Professor Kilovati also speaks on the race to develop quantum computing, a race in which both China and Russia are actively participating, and makes the need for strong encryption even more essential for a database of sensitive information. The US government is currently working on creating 4 quantum-resistant encryption algorithms, which would help protect against quantum computer hacks. In addition to foreign risks, Professor Kilovati discussed internal risks with providing significant information to the government for social media registration. He agrees with Professor Schloss's assertion that a bright line limit on the government's authority to retain and utilize data disclosed for social media registration systems are vital to making such a system work. In addition to protecting that data and only making it accessible on a need-to-know basis, Professor Kilovati calls for clearly established penalties for misuse of any of the data collected. In a world of cybersecurity and sensitive data, integrity and trust are important. especially following the recent Supreme Court case Van Buren versus US Supreme Court, or excuse me, just US, Van Buren versus US. They're not against the Supreme Court, which found that no crime is committed when an insider uses data that they were authorized to access for bad purposes, specifically involving the NSA, I think, spying on their lovers with information they already had the capacity to access. Finally, Professor Kilavati discusses the public-private nature of a social media registration system between the government and social media companies. Such a system requires a close relationship between the government and those companies, and that data sharing pipeline needs to be adequately protected. Finally, Professor Kilavati suggests that this may all come with unintended consequences, such as having foreign agents shift their targets from information warfare to attacking the social media platforms themselves, or even by engaging in cyber attacks outside of the social media realm. So again, it was my pleasure to share those highlights from Professor Kilavati's article on his behalf. And with that, we can turn it over to Professor Ryan Groff, who will lead us in our discussion portion. Thank you.
Ryan, is it okay if I say a couple of things in response to Professor Kilavati? Is that all right?
Yeah, I was hoping you'd be willing to do that. That'd be great. Thanks, Julia. And
okay, so thank you, Julia, for presenting on behalf of Professor Kilavati. I did get a chance to read his piece. I think most of what he says I view as a sort of set of friendly amendments to my proposed transnational regulatory system. I'm happy to admit that he has much greater expertise than I do on cybersecurity issues. And so I think much of what he says in his essay is really useful suggestions for how to make some tweaks to my proposal to basically improve protection for data security and improve protection for privacy. And in that respect, I welcome his comments. On the point about balkanization, let me just say that, so a lot of, what I will refer to as sort of first generation internet scholars have been upset for a while about this process that they refer to often as the splinternet. In the early days of the internet, there was this somewhat utopian vision of how we were going to have this great global communications platform to bring us all together. But that hasn't really existed for a while. Now, on a sort of baseline technical level, we do have an integrated platform. The internet allows communication, worldwide between, China, Russia, the US, and any other country in the world that you want to name, right? So that's not going away. We have the sort of technical level interconnections that allow communications among countries all over the world. But on the level of regulation, we have vastly different approaches to regulation if you compare sort of three main groups, right? Autocratic states as sort of represented by China and Russia, a European approach and a US approach. The US approach from a regulatory standpoint so far has actually been very libertarian. It's hands-off. The government mostly does not regulate social media or regulate the internet a whole lot, right? Europe has a very different approach, very privacy-focused, strong protections for user privacy. We're way behind Europe on that, although the European approach to privacy protection actually ends up affecting a lot of what happens in a whole bunch of countries outside of Europe, because companies basically need to comply with European rules in order to do business, right? But then in places like Russia and China and other autocratic states, you have a system that is essentially based on surveillance and censorship. The government wants to see everything that's going on. They want to control speech on the internet, and they do it. And they've developed effective systems to do it. So, to this, complaint about, well, my approach would sort of balkanize the internet. I think it's already happened. We've already got this. And in some ways, it actually might help reduce the split between the United States and Europe, which I think would be a good thing, right? It's a problem. On the question of, you raised the point about people distrusting governments, right? And this is a big issue, right? It's a big issue, whether we're talking about my proposal or more broadly, sort of what's going on in liberal democracies today, right? It's not just in the United States, it's a lot of liberal democracies where the level of trust in government has really declined. And that's certainly a major political obstacle to get anything like this proposal through Congress or through parliaments in other countries, right? So I don't have a great suggestion about how to overcome that political obstacle, but I think the political obstacle is real. And unfortunately, there are no good, quick, easy fixes about how do we sort of repair and rebuild trust in government. But I think that's an important project. So let me stop there and let's go to some other questions. Thank you.
All right, sounds good. And thank you for that response. I'd like to maybe sit here for a little bit, thinking about the regulatory possibilities. Some of the questions we received have to do with Congress and social media companies being able to collaborate together. But even before they're collaborating, even before they're passing laws, I'm remembering a few years ago, Mark Zuckerberg appeared before a committee, and there was questions about even how his company made money. And so even at the very basic level, is there some education, maybe at a cultural level, at a society level, maybe even just in Congress, that we need to get to before we can even think of regulating? What are some of those preliminary steps before we get to even the discussions of passing these policies?
Well, I think members of Congress today are much more knowledgeable about social media and technology companies generally than they were 5 or 10 years ago. There's been a big effort on the part of Congress to get up to speed, and obviously there's big disparities between older and younger members of Congress generally in this respect. But they rely on their staffs, and the staffs are younger, and there's a lot of staff people there who have a lot of expertise. So I don't think that sort of ignorance among members of Congress is nearly the obstacle that it was like 5 or 10 years ago. I would also say that one of the things that's important to note here is there's already a lot of collaboration going on between the government and social media companies. This is largely as a result of revelations about Russian interference in the 2016 election. But once information started coming out about Russian interference in 2016, Facebook actually developed in-house what they call their information warfare team. And their information warfare team is staffed primarily with people who used to work in government in agencies like the Department of Homeland Security and the National Security Agency and places like that. So you've got a lot of in-house expertise within Facebook. Less has been published about this for the other social media companies, but I'm assuming it's probably also true for Google and maybe to a lesser extent Twitter. They hire these former government people who are expert in information technology, and those people sort of serve as liaisons with current government employees. So there's lots and lots of back channel communication and cooperation between the government and the major social media platforms in addressing this information warfare problem. And frankly, one of the virtues of my proposal is it would bring that out into the open, instead of it all happening sort of behind closed doors in a way that sort of lacks transparency. This would sort of formalize the process, create more transparency so that we know more about actually that interaction between government and the companies is happening within an established regulatory framework that requires some transparency, some public reporting, rather than it all being secret and behind closed doors, and we really don't know much about what's going on. So okay, let me stop there and turn it back to Ryan.
Yeah, we'll keep going here. So we got a few questions around this idea of allowing sort of an international third party like a NATO or a UN to sort of play a role here and maybe be an arbiter or mediator of some sort. What's your thoughts on that? Response to that sort of other than a governmental approach, these sort of intergovernmental organizations?
Yeah, so the proposal, as I said, calls for this Alliance for Democracy, which would be a new international organization. It would have a small staff, but that staff would have some key decisions to make and key role to play in terms of implementing the system. Primarily, there are going to be factual disputes about whether some, let's say, some Russian person, wants to set up an account. They claim that, oh, I'm not working as an agent of the state. I'm just a private individual who wants to set up an account. Somebody's going to have to make a decision about, well, is this really just a private individual or is this person a state agent, right? If it's really going to be a multilateral system, France doesn't want the US government making that decision. The US government doesn't want France making that decision. There's got to be this small staff of international civil servants who basically have access to sufficient information to be able to make those judgments. Now, sometimes there may be disagreements and that'll have to be bucked up to a diplomatic level, and you might have some diplomatic correspondence. But what I'm proposing here is really sort of modeled on what the UN has done with the so-called Sanctions Committee. So after 9/11, there was a lot of effort to cut off financial support for terrorism. And under UN sanctions, that required some individualized judgments about who's a terrorist and who's not, right? And again, because this is being implemented by the UN, you can't just leave it to the US to say, this person's a terrorist, this person is not, because the rest of the world doesn't necessarily trust us to make these judgments. So we've got this UN Sanctions Committee that is staffed by people from different countries who are given the responsibility for deciding who's a terrorist subject to sanctions and who's not, right? So we have a model out there, that there have been some problems with that, right? It's not perfect. It comes under some criticism, but I think it's worked reasonably well to allow multilateral cooperation to implement this sort of international sanctions regime revolving around terrorism, right? And I would envision a similar kind of system here that would get at who is a Chinese state agent, who is a Russian state agent, who gets to qualify as a benign state agent, right? Who do we think, okay, this is a state agent, but they're transparent, they're open, they're upfront about what they're doing. Maybe it's okay to let them on the system, Those kinds of judgments, again, would have to be dealt with through some kind of multilateral process.
All right, great. So here's a question shifting a little bit more from the policy angle and thinking about governments, again, joined government agencies or nations themselves. This is the focus sort of on us, the end user. So this idea frames it as there's the idea of this sort of the useful idiot problem in social media, and that's not new to social media. That sort of player has been around forever. But the question is posed this way: do you expect Russia will be able to continuously rely on quote unquote useful idiots, or is this person, is this moment, is this because of a temporal problem? Is there something right now that's causing the use or the existence of that player, of that role? So I'll stop there.
All right, thank you. No, that's a good question. So just to sort of clarify for the audience, Russia has, at least since the time of Lenin, if not before, had a pretty well thought out strategy for how they conduct foreign influence operations. And this idea of a useful idiot has actually been central to Russian strategy in this respect for, I'd say at least 100 years. And the idea is that, if you want to influence what's going on, say, in the United Kingdom, what you do is you find British citizens who will essentially do some of your work for you, right? And who will essentially be, not paid agents of the Russian government, but just people who the Russian government can exploit to help carry out their influence operations. And if you can identify these so-called useful idiots, it's a good strategy, right? Because, you think about other British citizens are more likely to sort of accept a message coming from their fellow British citizens than they are the same message coming from somebody who is Russian, So Russia has used this strategy for a long time to conduct foreign influence operations in a variety of different countries. This is not new with the internet, and it's not going to end anytime soon. I think they're going to continue to do this. Now, I say in the book that Donald Trump is a sort of a classic example of a useful idiot, and he may be, this may be the single greatest sort of Russian tactical victory in a foreign influence operation. Donald Trump's whole presidency was supporting Russian foreign policy goals. What was one of their key goals was to basically weaken NATO. Donald Trump single-handedly did a whole bunch of policies that weaken NATO, not because he's acting as a Russian agent, but just because it happened that his views sort of aligned with their views. So this is one reason that Putin wanted Russia to win the presidential election in 2016, is at a certain point, Putin decided, hey, we're much better off with Donald Trump as president than we are with Hillary Clinton as president. And they were probably right about that. That was a sort of a great victory for Putin. But he's actually identified a lot of people in, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Sweden, different European countries who he can utilize to sort of carry out Russian foreign policy aims. So unless we see a major transformation in Russia, at some point, I think they will continue to try to exploit useful idiots to help advance their foreign policy goals.
Just maybe continuing there, do you see the current situation, the current attack on Ukraine, and maybe even the developing tensions in Taiwan, do you see those as extensions of your theories in the book, or do you see those as tweaks, as developing into something new? I'm just interested in your sort of commentary on the present.
Yeah, well, actually, there's been some interesting stuff published since the Russian invasion of Ukraine that, at least based on the information available now, they made far less use of cyber warfare and information warfare than people would have predicted in advance. And I'm not quite sure why that is. Now, they've certainly done made some efforts in this space, but Ukraine looks like a, classic military operation, not too different from what might have been carried out before the advent of the internet, right? The internet has not had a huge impact on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, it's had some. For example, there's been a lot in the news lately about how Elon Musk has made Starlink available to commanders in Ukraine, and that's actually been hugely helpful for them in, communicating between commanders and troops in the field and getting real-time information about what's happening on the ground so they can make decisions. So that's not social media, but it is a sort of modern digital communications tool that has actually been very helpful for Ukraine in defending against Russia. But based on publicly available information, Russia has not made nearly as aggressive use of cyber warfare tactics or information warfare tactics as one might have expected. So, what does that do with a thesis in my book? I'm not sure. It's a somewhat different, different issue, really, right? But that is sort of interesting. Now, China and Taiwan. Taiwan is the place where China makes the most aggressive use of information warfare tactics. China is meddling in Taiwanese democracy all the time, and China has lots of tools available to do that. Chinese efforts in that respect have not been very successful. Right? These days, I just saw some public opinion polling data recently from Taiwan. China's main goal here is reunification of Taiwan with the motherland. Right now, latest data shows there are only about 6 or 7% of the Taiwanese population that favor reunification with China. So in some ways, one of the things that really affected that number was the Chinese takeover of Hong Kong, right? What China did in Hong Kong made a lot of Taiwanese really, really nervous. And so since the events in Hong Kong a couple of years ago, public opinion in Taiwan has turned very much more against China. There's a problem for China. China uses a wide variety of sort of information warfare tactics to try and influence what's happening in Taiwan, but they've not been very successful in doing that.
Excellent. Well, we've talked a lot about foreign policy and governments. Got a question here about your research and how that went for you. So I'll just read the question here. So as social media is relatively new, what obstacles did you face while researching and finding support for your book? Was it difficult to find literature or law to support the policy recommendations that you came to? And it ends with a final question. How did you draw inferences from less commonly connected topics, to such a novel one?
Well, that's a great question. Frankly, the biggest obstacle in my research, at least at the beginning, was I knew absolutely nothing about social media. When I started on this project, I did not have a social media account. I was not a social media user. And it was a bit intimidating to dive into it. And one thing I did was I hired a guy in his 20s and said, look, I really need you to educate me about social media. So it took several months of us working together for me to sort of get up to speed on the technology and begin to understand it. And still, there are a lot of people out there who understand this stuff a lot better than I do. But, one of the great things about the internet is there's just a million sources available to us, right? I mean, in the age of the internet, the problem is it's almost never too little information. The problem is too much information. And how do you sort of sift through the many, many, many sources out there in order to find stuff that's useful? But I will say there are a few different academic research institutes. Excuse me, I'm going to just grab a sip here. A few different academic research institutes that I found incredibly helpful. One is the Oxford Internet Institute at Oxford University in the UK. One is the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which is in Australia. One is the Stanford, what do they call themselves now? Stanford Center on sort of Internet and Society or something like that. There are so many different research centers at Stanford. I have a hard time keeping track of which one is which. There's a good group at Harvard too that I found some useful information. So, and a couple of NGOs that are DC based. The Alliance for Democracy, which is associated with the German Marshall Fund based in DC. So there's lots of these different research institutes out there that do sort of what I would call the primary research of actually sort of monitoring what's happening on social media, publish reports based on that. I'm not spending time like, a lot of time looking at, big data sets that are put out there by like Twitter and Facebook, which they do, right? I'm rather reading the reports published by these researchers who are going through those data sets to see what they can extract, right? So that kind of stuff was really helpful. The Mueller report was hugely helpful. There's a lot of books out there. I will say, one of the best books I read in doing research for this project was a book by a group of scholars at Harvard called Network Propaganda. And they developed some very sophisticated tools for basically looking at how information, and particularly misinformation, spreads between traditional or legacy media, meaning television and radio, and social media, and how the interaction between legacy media and social media contributes to the spread of misinformation. And their work is really important because I think there's a misconception out there that the primary engine for distribution of misinformation is social media, but that's not really accurate. Misinformation spreads because of this interactions between social media, radio, television, and it's cable TV that has the biggest audience. So you really want to get misinformation to spread. What you have to do is it typically will start out on social media, but if you get Fox News to pick it up and spread it, then you'll reach a really, really big audience, right? And there's basically nobody on social media other than Donald Trump before they shut down his Twitter account who could reach as big an audience on social media as, Tucker Carlson reaches on CNN.
All right, let's go to, so maybe on that note, the idea of a registration just in general, I think as you pointed out and you picked up already in your talk, that's going to raise flags for folks. And one of the problems of misinformation is people are already maybe more distrustful of a government actor. And so how do you propose a registration in that environment and especially the person posing this question presented the idea that there's already a decay of objective reality, objective truth, that we can sort of share the same facts and come to different conclusions. No, we don't even have the same facts anymore. So in that environment, how do we even propose or even get some of these policies to be listened to or even considered?
Well, I think that really in order for something along the lines that I've proposed to move forward, you need leadership from the executive branch. Congress so there's a lot of interest in Congress these days in regulating social media, but Congress is deeply divided between the left and the right about what type of regulation they think is appropriate. But when the executive branch steps in and says, we need to do this for national security reasons, there's at least some tendency on the part of Congress to sort of defer to the executive and go along with the executive for, on something that is sort of presented as a national security initiative. And these days, one area in which there is bipartisan support in Congress is we need to do more to sort of fight back against China, right? So there are some political risks in sort of presenting this as a sort of an anti-China measure. But I also think that that's probably the best way to sell it on the Hill. Now, that, honestly, do I think that my proposal is going to actually end up leading to an international agreement and be codified in law anytime in the next few years? Probably not, right? There's the political hurdles to this are really really hard to overcome. One of the difficulties is that you need to be able to carry on a conversation diplomatically with our key allies, in Europe, and not just in Europe, but Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea. They all sort of need to be brought on board in this. For that audience, pitching it as a sort of an anti-China measure would likely backfire, right? They don't want to be signing on, most of them do not want to be signing on publicly to a sort of, an anti-Chinese initiative, right? So if you think about it from the standpoint of the executive branch, somebody in the executive branch who's trying to pitch this proposal to allies at the same time as trying to sell it to Congress, there's a real danger here of sort of the messaging for different audiences sort of getting at cross purposes, right? And so, that's a really tricky task to try and carry out.
Yeah, and maybe just thinking along that vein, how policy positions and the way the U.S. even kind of lives out some of its decisions. We had a question here about how the tagging of foreign nationals could relate to the decision in Korematsu. Do you have any thoughts on that and how that might affect our ability to move forward with any of those registration requirements?
Yeah, so I want to be clear here that the tagging is not a tagging of all foreign nationals, and it's not a tagging of them as foreigners, right? So the basic dividing line here is not between the US and everybody else. The basic dividing line is between liberal democracies and everybody else, I know that, people, I've talked about this book to different audiences in different contexts, even starting long before I really had a manuscript for the book, right? When it was in the sort of early stages of development. And, this concern comes up regularly about, well, are you feeding a sort of xenophobic fear here? But I don't think so, because it really is not about sort of, all foreigners are suspicious, right? Under this system, there would be, as I said, about, people from about 35 or 40 countries who would get unrestricted free speech. So if somebody from France or Canada or Australia wants to comment on US elections, that's not going to be tagged. Right? What's going to be tagged is somebody from, Iraq or Venezuela or, Serbia who wants to comment on US elections. And I think that basic, whether we like it or not, the reality is that the world these days is becoming more divided between democracies and autocracies. And going back to those graphs that I presented at the beginning of the talk, democracy really is in decline. And if we believe that liberal democracy is a good system of government, we've got to be willing to take measures to protect liberal democracy. And we can't do that without drawing some kind of dividing lines between liberal democracies and everybody else.
Got a question here, maybe turning the microscope on ourselves a little bit. So this question came: when the United States toppled democracies and supported certain autocracies as part of the Cold War, were those acts justifiable, seemingly illiberal policies that preserved the value of liberalism? When the United States sort of maybe acted in these ways too? And maybe an extra question: do we have anything to learn from our own history of maybe using some of these tactics?
Well, there's certainly a lot we can learn from our own history. And some of the tactics we used, I think, were ill-conceived then and proved to be ill-conceived later. I mean, if you look at, where we are in our relationship with Iran right now, it goes back to basically, toppling the leadership of Iran in the 50s and installing a sort of a friendly dictator, namely the Shah. And the Shah ruled Iran for roughly 25 years, I think from 1954 to 1979, if I remember correctly. And the Shah was, widely hated and reviled within Iran. And that's the basis for a lot of anti-American sentiment in Iran that carries on to this day. They see us, they still see the US as responsible for sort of imposing on them this dictator who was really brutal and, and did not do good things for the people of Iran. I mean, there were a small number of people who, got very wealthy from the oil wealth, but, so certainly a lot of our prior foreign interventions, I think, have been ill-conceived and have not in the long term sort of benefited us, caused us some long-term damage. So I definitely want to sort of avoid that. I don't think, but does that mean, one of the legacies, I guess, of that is that, there's a lot of people in other parts of the world who fundamentally distrust the US. And that, if you think about trying to do something on a multilateral level, that really hurts us, right? And this is, look, no question, President Trump made this problem worse, right? So if you think about the US ability to sort of pull together a coalition of liberal democracies in support of some new international institution or international agreement, we were in a much better place to do that 10 years ago than we are now, because after the Trump administration, there's a lot of countries in the world who, and countries that I consider our friends, right? Other liberal democracies who say, well, why should we enter into an agreement with you? Because for all we know, 2 years from now, after the next election, the next US president is just going to come along and tear it up and throw it out, So that's a big obstacle. And, we will continue to live with the consequences of, past bad decisions.
I got a question here, thinking at the intersection of the three different kinds of free speech models that I think you reviewed. There's the autocratic model, there's the European model, and there's the current United States model, which tends to lean a little bit more libertarian. My apologies if I've gotten any of that wrong, but you can correct me in your answer here. The question has to do with, the example is, in Germany, there's free speech rules that restrict against anti-Semitic speech, National Socialistic comments, just sort of quoting from the question. So kind of just putting it to you, when those maybe those latter two kinds, maybe there's not autocratic countries in that discussion trying to create this agreement that, where do you think they end up? Do you think they end up leaning a little more towards what the U.S. looks like right now, a little bit more towards what Europe looks like right now? How does that end?
Where does who end up? Sorry, I'm not sure I'm understanding.
Where does that Committee for Democracy? I apologize. I'm forgetting the exact name of that sort of
the Alliance for Democracy.
Yeah, the Alliance for Democracy. How do they deal with some of those differences? Maybe they're nuances, but maybe they're a little bigger.
Right. Well, okay. So the Alliance for Democracy would not include any autocratic states, so we can sort of leave them out, although I may come back to them in a minute. But I don't, the proposal that I have sort of set forth in the book does not require the US and Europeans to resolve basic disagreements about what are acceptable limits on free speech, right? For example, there's been a longstanding disagreement between the US and Europe on hate speech, right? Europeans think, and in fact, there are international human rights treaties out there that say you have a duty to ban hate speech, right? The US has opted out of this, and to the extent that we've signed on to those treaties, we've taken reservations saying, well, we'll become a part of this treaty, but we won't agree to this requirement to ban hate speech. Hate speech is seen here as constitutionally protected speech, right? So nothing in my proposal requires the US and Europe to reach a common agreement on matters like that, like hate speech, where there are basic disagreements about what kind of speech should be constitutionally protected and what kind should not, right? It does require us to reach agreement on banning Chinese and Russian agents, right? But that's not going against core free speech values in any country, I don't think, although certain libertarians in the United States would disagree with me on that, and say it really does go against sort of libertarian values in the US. But we have a variety of other restrictions on foreign agents that have withstood constitutional scrutiny. It does require the US probably to move, frankly, further in the European direction in terms of privacy protections, right? But personally, I think that would be a good thing. And I think there are a lot of people in the US who would like to see us move further in the European direction in terms of privacy protections, so that while the support for that is not universal, I think there's pretty widespread support for that in the US, and certainly added privacy protections don't go against any core First Amendment values in the United States, right? So there would continue to be differences between the US and Europe. It would require us to come together on certain things, but I think the areas where it would require us to come together don't impact what I think are sort of deep cultural divides that will remain.
Yeah, and I think maybe we even see kind of some laboratories of law here in the United States with the passing of the California Comprehensive Privacy Agreement, and many other states kind of following suit. So yeah, I think there's probably some good evidence for that. Got a question here, just sort of flat out and very short. The idea that the person says there will always be a Cold War. What's the end condition of this framework?
Well, I don't agree that there will always be a Cold War. I think the last Cold War really did end in 1990, and we did have a period that's often referred to as the post-Cold War era. And the transition from the post-Cold War era to the new Cold War, if you will, has been sort of gradual. It didn't happen overnight, right? So I don't know. I don't have a good enough crystal ball to say, how does the new Cold War end? I think it's going to be with us for quite a while. If you look at what, the news coming out of China in the last couple of days, Xi Jinping has basically installed himself as dictator for life at this point, as far as I can tell. He's now got a sort of a central committee that are all his loyalists, his supporters. He's surrounding himself with yes men. He doesn't have, and they are all, by the way, men, no women in the sort of top leadership in China. They are all, he didn't do anything to indicate plans for a transition to a successor after this 5-year period. So technically, he's only now been, reinstalled as General Secretary of the Communist Party for another 5 years, but lots of indications that that will be extended and extended into the future. Now, there are a bunch of China commentators these days who are saying, yeah, but he's actually done a whole lot of stuff recently that is beginning to undermine China's economic success story. I think that's true. The zero COVID policy has been really bad for China economically. The crackdown on tech companies has been bad for China economically. At some point, if the Chinese sort of economic miracle, if you will, starts to look like past history rather than current reality, he may face more challenges domestically. But But, you know, it's hard to see when that's going to happen or if it's going to happen. And as long as he's in power in China, I would say, we're going to continue in this sort of Cold War vein for a while, unfortunately. You know? I did want to say one other thing, going back to these different models of information management and control, if you will. One piece that I only touch upon a little bit in the book, but that I think is really important, is that if you look at who is exporting information technology around the world, China is now the leading exporter of information technology, particularly digital information technology, to the global south. And there's been some very interesting research that shows that essentially, once you equip an autocratic government with digital information tools, it tends to strengthen autocratic rule. Autocratic governments can use those digital information tools very effectively to conduct surveillance on their own population, to conduct censorship on their own population in ways that essentially make it harder for people to organize sustained resistance and protests, and easier for dictators to basically hang on to power. So empirical social science research shows that the spread of information, digital information technology, tends to be associated with dictators staying in power longer. And China is fueling this trend with its export of digital information technology to countries all over the world. And I think this is also a very troubling development in terms of thinking about the balance in the world between democracy and autocracy. You know? And it's a piece of the puzzle that's related here that I think is worth just highlighting briefly.
Excellent. Just maybe back to the end user for a little bit here at the end. Sorry, my dog's barking.
That's okay.
So many of us, or I won't speak for everybody, but we use social media as a way to gain the information that we use to understand the world around us, right?
Yeah.
So are there habits? Are there daily habits and ways of being that we need to also cultivate outside of regulations, outside of new policy proposals, outside of international collaborations? From all your research, have you ended with any suggestions for each of us individually?
Yeah, so I think we all need to be cautious about the information we're getting from social media. It can be a great source of information, but it also can be a great source of misinformation. So I will point to Sweden as a model here. One of the things that Sweden has done is they've done a very extensive and very sophisticated sort of citizen education program to try and make their citizens smarter about how to recognize red flags, how to, sort of see indicators when they're getting stuff on social media that maybe tells them, oh, I better double check this before I just sort of assume this is true. So I do think there's a lot useful that can be done in sort of educating the American population about how to be more intelligent consumers of information that we receive on social media and on the internet more broadly, right? The problem for the US is Sweden has a very centralized education system. They can come up with one program and basically roll it out nationally, and it actually, has been pretty successful. We have a very decentralized education system, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And that makes it much more difficult to sort of do this kind of citizen education program. But that said, I do think it's a useful thing to do. And I think, just each one of us individually needs to be a little bit skeptical of stuff that we see on social media and stuff that we see on the internet. And, this is good training for lawyers everywhere, right? Is check your sources, make sure that you corroborate your source and don't just accept whatever you see as being true, but sort of go back and double check it,
Yeah, I guess the 1L LRW advice of cite everything maybe is a good way to
Yeah.
some good enduring advice. Well, Professor Sloss, thank you so much. At this point, we'll turn things back over to Julia.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you both. This has been such an enlightening conversation, and I'm hesitant to even try to end it as we come to the end of our full time today. I just want to offer a sincere thank you again to Professor Sloss for coming and taking the time to speak to us. Thank you, Professor Groff, for also being here as a wonderful moderator. And thank you to everyone who was present and offered questions and insight. I can say with utmost confidence that we received so many more questions than we were able to go through today. And I just want to thank everyone for that contribution, for that level of engagement. This was an incredible conversation, and I am so pleased we were able to be here today to participate and witness.
Julia, let me just thank you for inviting me to do this and for organizing this event. And thanks also to your team who pulled it together and made it happen. And thanks to Ryan for being a terrific moderator. So I enjoyed this, and I hope it was worthwhile for everybody.
Thank you so much. That means a lot.
Okay.
And with that, I think we will close for this evening.